Why in the era of bloodletting and dirty aprons were hospitals built as if they had been designed by people who already understood the power of sunlight? And why do these buildings look more like palaces than shelters for the dying? The official picture of the 19th century is familiar to everyone. Smoke, coal, slums, overcrowded wards, surgeons who until quite recently did not wash their hands before operations. All of that is true, but it is not the whole truth. It is enough to look at the surviving hospitals of that era, and a stark contradiction appears. Before us are not cramped sheds. Before us are monumental complexes, with colonnades, with domes, with long galleries, and with windows so tall that today you rarely see them even in expensive public buildings. These windows were not a minor detail. They occupied a significant part of the façade. They rose to 2, 3, sometimes 4 human heights. They provided not just illumination, but a flood of light. And this is especially strange if we remember that we are talking about places where people were gravely ill and often dying. The official explanation sounds simple: light and ventilation, sanitary reforms. The influence of Florence Nightingale. In her writings of the mid-19th century, there really are direct requirements. Wards must receive plenty of light. Air must circulate freely. Windows must be large. Everything is logical. But this is where the most important part begins. These principles existed not only after Nightingale. They are visible in buildings that appeared long before her. And that already breaks the convenient scheme in which everything supposedly began with the reformers of modern times. Look at the Hôtel-Dieu in Paris. This is not a random structure, but an institution with a centuries-long history. Or at the Ospedale Maggiore in Milan, founded as early as the 15th century. Both complexes show the same thing: clear geometry, symmetry, spacious courtyards, galleries, high openings, solid stone masonry. Everything speaks of a thought-out system, not chaos. And here is what is especially curious. When we are told about the dark past of medicine, they usually say almost nothing about how mature hospital architecture itself already was. This is visible in later examples as well. The Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris began to be developed as early as the 17th century. Then it was expanded in the 18th and 19th centuries. In old engravings, enormous arched windows are clearly visible. They run in series. They flood the halls with light. The interiors look not like a warehouse of beds, but like a space where light was part of the building's very function. We see the same thing in the Royal Naval Hospital at Greenwich, a design by Christopher Wren. The late 17th and early 18th century. Formally, it is a hospital. In appearance, almost a palace ensemble. Domes, colonnades, symmetry, and again large windows that bring light into corridors, halls and wards. One might object that this was simply the style of the era. Baroque, grandeur, architectural fashion. Fine. But then the next question arises. Why does the same logic repeat itself again and again afterward? From London to St. Petersburg, from Vienna to New York, already in the 19th century, in new hospital buildings, in different countries, by different architects. If the same device appears dozens of times, it is no longer a whim of taste. It is a canon. It is knowledge that someone considered important and passed on. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine not only well-known dates, but also the hidden logic of old buildings. Now to the strangest part. It is not only about the size of the windows. It is about how exactly they worked inside the space. Studies of old hospital plans have shown an important pattern. The placement of openings was often governed by orientation to the cardinal directions. East and south were often given priority. This provided soft morning light and prolonged daylight illumination. Today this seems obvious, but for the 19th century, such precision looks unexpected. At that time, medicine was still arguing about the nature of disease. The miasma theory long competed with ideas about microbes. Years remained before the bacterial theory gained broad recognition. And yet architecture was already behaving as if light had an almost therapeutic significance. And there is an even stronger detail. In a number of hospital wards, the windows and the arrangement of beds were organized so that a direct ray of sunlight at certain hours, not just the floor, not just the wall, precisely the zones where the patients lay. To achieve such an effect, calculations are needed. Geometry is needed. An understanding of the sun's path at different times of the year is needed. Project discipline is needed. This cannot be written off as coincidence. if it occurs repeatedly. The official version responds in the usual way. Practice. Observation. Experienced architects. Possibly. But experience too has to come from somewhere. If builders repeated the same principle again and again, then they saw the result. That means light was regarded not as decoration. And here history runs up against the science of light. According to the accepted chronology, the bactericidal properties of ultraviolet radiation began to be studied only at the end of the 19th century. Niels Finsen received the Nobel Prize at the beginning of the 20th century for his work on the therapeutic effects of light rays. This is usually presented as the moment of discovery, as if before that no one understood that sunlight could suppress disease. But the buildings say otherwise. They seem to have preserved practical knowledge before it was ever formalized into a scientific formula. If hospitals were being built 100, 150, and sometimes 200 years before Finsen in such a way that sunlight penetrated as deeply as possible, then the question can no longer be brushed aside. Why did architects who supposedly knew nothing about the bactericidal effect of light act as if they did know? Why did medical institutions so insistently seek the direct ray, the height of the opening and the correct orientation of the facade? This is not a minor oddity. It is a serious gap between the official chronology of science and the actual practice of construction, and it is precisely in such gaps that the most interesting things are often hidden. And here, in essence, there are two explanations. The first sounds almost conservative. Knowledge of how light affects a sick person may have existed long before official discoveries, not in the form of a textbook, not in the form of an academic theory, but in the form of tradition, a craft canon, and a professional secret passed from master to apprentice. The second explanation is far more unsettling. These buildings may not have been built by quite the people we are used to thinking of as their authors, and possibly not quite when we are told. This is exactly where the architectural anomalies begin. If you have been in old European hospitals, in the authentic buildings of the 19th century and earlier, you have surely felt this strangeness. The scale there is different. The ceilings do not seem merely high. They seem excessive. The windows take up almost the entire wall. The staircases are wide and gentle. The corridors are so spacious that it is as if they were designed for an entirely different flow of people and for an entirely different purpose. The official explanation is well known. Representation, a demonstration of state power, ostentatious charity, psychological comfort for patients. All of this sounds convincing, but it does not explain the main thing: why the same proportions are repeated again and again, in different countries, in different decades, by different architects, with such precision, as if they all had a single model before them. And here the archives begin to say very strange things. In a number of cases, the drawings are dated earlier than the buildings themselves. Sometimes the gap is years, sometimes decades, and sometimes it gets even more curious. In the archives of France, Germany, Russia, and Britain, very similar projects surface, and at times almost direct copies. But there is no clear path of transmission, no chain that can be confidently traced. What emerges is the sense of a common source, a single school, or a lost tradition that later people simply stopped naming aloud. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine exactly those moments in history that usually remain outside the bounds of textbooks. The main question now sounds like this: what if the huge windows of 19th century hospitals were not an innovation of their era? What if they were an inheritance, a remnant of a much older knowledge about light and health? And here it is worth looking back, very far back, to ancient Egypt. Sources translated in the 19th and 20th centuries describe special rooms attached to temples that were used for healing. They are often called sun chambers. The sick were placed in rooms where sunlight entered at a certain time of day and at the required angle. Different light was used for different conditions: morning, midday, evening. At first glance, this looks like ritual, like ancient mysticism. But if we set aside our habitual condescension, the picture changes. The spectrum of sunlight really does change throughout the day. Morning and evening light are softer. Midday provides the maximum ultraviolet radiation. Today we know that light affects the production of vitamin D, circadian rhythms, the immune response, and even mental state. And then the ancient Egyptian practice no longer looks like blind magic. It begins to look like observational medicine grounded in the experience of many generations. There are similar hints in the Greek tradition. Hippocrates wrote about the importance of good lighting in rooms for the sick. This is usually presented as a stroke of genius, an intuition, but perhaps it was not intuition, but systematic knowledge, already accumulated, already tested, already built into medical practice, and then a gap appears, the Middle Ages. Hospitals, almshouses, leprosaria were often dark. The windows were small, the walls were thick, there was little light. We are told this was due to general decline, primitive technology, and a religious view of illness as punishment, where humility mattered more than comfort, a familiar version. But it does not withstand a simple comparison. Look at the Gothic cathedrals of the same era. They have gigantic stained glass windows. They show extraordinarily complex work with height, light, and load-bearing. They display an engineering precision, so the issue was not that the builders did not know how. They did. Very much so. Which means dark hospitals were not the result of helplessness, but the result of choice. A conscious choice. And that already changes the whole conversation. If knowledge about light existed, why was it applied in some types of buildings and not in others? Who decided where light was needed and where it was not? And why did this approach change so sharply in the 19th century? This is where building fraternities and Masonic lodges enter the story. An uncomfortable subject. But archives are stubborn. Many architects who designed major hospitals, universities, libraries, and courthouses in the 19th century, this is not speculation. Their names, connections, and memberships are documented. Within these communities, knowledge was often passed on not through open publication, but along the line of master and apprentice, through manuscripts, through oral instruction, through closed systems of training. And among the researchers who managed to see part of these materials, astonishing testimony surfaces from time to time. They mention calculations of the angle of incidence of sunlight taking into account latitude, season, and facade orientation. They mention the proportions of window openings, lighting regimes for different types of rooms. And this is especially important when hospitals are concerned. A strange picture emerges. Official science formulated many conclusions about the healing effect of light in the late 19th and 20th centuries. But builders may have been taking these principles into account much earlier. Where did masters of the 17th and 18th centuries get this knowledge? Did they inherit it from antiquity? Receive it through closed schools? Preserve fragments of a more ancient practice? There is no exact answer yet, but the very density of the coincidences is too great to simply dismiss. And now we can move to the most tangible level. Not theories, not beautiful versions, but concrete architectural details that researchers often see, yet rarely try to explain fully. In many 19th century hospitals this is visible at once, especially in France, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Russia. We are talking about details that seem trivial, but they are precisely what changes the entire perception of these buildings. Window sills there were often made not straight, but slanted inward toward the ward. This was not a craftsman's whim, and not decoration. Such a sill caught sunlight and reflected it deeper into the room. The beam did not fall only on the floor by the window. It rose toward the ceiling, reached the far wall, and softened the shadows in the corners. As a result, the ward was lit more evenly. For a hospital, this was important. Light helped the doctor see details. For the patient, it gave a sense of air and spaciousness. Today this principle is studied as daylighting and passive lighting design. The names are new. The idea itself is old. It was being applied 150 or 200 years ago, and in a very confident and systematic way. Moreover, in some old hospital buildings, light tubes were also found. These are vertical channels within the thickness of the walls. They were lined with reflective material. They carried light from the upper floors, or from the roof downward, to places where an ordinary window could no longer help. And this is where the most interesting part begins. Modern architecture long regarded such solutions as an achievement of the 20th century. But real buildings refute that scheme. Similar techniques are found not only in the 19th century, they have also been found in earlier structures, sometimes medieval, sometimes even ancient. It turns out that knowledge of how light works did not develop in a straight line. It appeared, disappeared, and returned again. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine architecture not through myths, but through the traces left in stone, glass, and old drawings. Now about glass. Large windows are not just wide openings. They also require large sheets of glass. Heavy, fragile, difficult to manufacture. The official version says this: Large sheet glass was only mastered for mass production by the middle of the 19th century. First came the cylinder method. Later a more advanced method arrived. Before that, it is believed, windows were assembled from many small pieces set in frames. But here the archives and the buildings themselves once again raise uncomfortable questions. In houses of the 17th and 18th centuries, large glass sheets are found. So large that according to the usual scheme they should not be there. The usual answer is simple. The glass was replaced later, in the 19th or 20th century. That did indeed happen. But then another problem arises. In old inventories from those same centuries, large sheets of glass are already mentioned, and in engravings from that time, windows often appear glazed with whole panes rather than a set of small inserts. There is another oddity as well. In some laboratory studies, the composition of old glass showed similarities to samples from much earlier eras, sometimes ancient ones, sometimes even older. This does not prove a single secret, but it certainly breaks the simple picture of continuous progress. It seems that glass-making technologies too may have been lost and then returned. Against this background, the story of Florence Nightingale sounds different already. She is usually presented as the woman who brought order, statistics and sanitary reform into medicine. That is true, but if you read her text carefully, something else becomes visible. She is not so much inventing a new hospital as describing the proper hospital as an already known type. Large windows, direct sunlight, orientation by the cardinal directions, high ceilings, cross ventilation. All this looks less like a fantasy of the future and more like a return to an old standard that once existed and was later lost. And then the main question arises. If these principles were known, why did they have to be proven again? What happened between the era of bright, spacious wards and the time when the need for sun and air once again became a matter of debate? Official history answers cautiously. Development was slow. There were setbacks. There were breakthroughs. But there is another point of view. It is voiced by independent researchers, architectural historians, and specialists in old materials. According to this version, the history of cities was repeatedly interrupted by major catastrophes that destroyed not only buildings, practical knowledge. One need only look at the chronicle of great fires. London in 1666, Moscow in 1812, Chicago in 1871, Boston in 1872, San Francisco in 1906. After such disasters, old districts vanished in entire swaths, and along with them disappeared building techniques, local schools, and craft traditions. Then the cities were rebuilt, already according to new standards, sometimes more rationally, sometimes more cheaply, sometimes more simply. But at times old proportions and old lighting solutions suddenly reappeared in the new buildings, as if someone still remembered after all. There is another important layer to this story as well. Psychological and physiological. Some 19th century authors wrote about sunlight not only as a remedy against dampness and infection, they saw in it a force that sustains life itself. Today this no longer sounds mystical. Modern science knows about circadian rhythms, about the role of light in the production of serotonin and melatonin, about the connection between ultraviolet radiation and the synthesis of vitamin D. But back then those terms did not yet exist. People simply observed. In bright wards, patients slept better. They recovered more quickly after operations. They fell into severe apathy less often. In the morning they felt more vigor, which means the knowledge existed at least on the level of practice. It could be passed on not through university articles, but through masters' schools, building guilds, and closed professional circles, not necessarily secret in the romantic sense. It is enough that a craft often lives within a narrow tradition and is easily broken if that chain is interrupted. And now the strangest part. In recent years, archive researchers have found unusual calculations in a number of 19th century hospital projects. German, French, and Russian documents contain notes next to window dimensions. There, the width of the opening, the angle of inclination, the ceiling height, and the geographic latitude, different times of the year. Such calculations are possible in themselves. They are confirmed by astronomy and geometric optics. But some of the numbers in these formulas look especially mysterious. We are talking about values connected with the passage of ultraviolet radiation through the atmosphere at different angles of incidence of light. Such data can only be obtained experimentally. Measurements are needed. Yet officially such equipment is assigned to a later period. So where did these figures in 19th century drawings come from? Who obtained them? Exactly when? And using what apparatus? There are still few answers, but the question itself matters. It forces us to look at old hospitals not as naive architecture of the past, perhaps incomplete, perhaps inherited, perhaps already poorly understood by the later builders themselves, but knowledge nonetheless. That is why the huge windows of old hospital buildings catch the eye so strongly. It is not just a beautiful facade. It is the trace of a practice in which light was considered part of treatment, part of order, part of the very structure of life inside the building. And the more closely you look at these windows, at the slanted sills, at the depth of the openings, at the height of the ceilings, believe that all this arose by chance or from aesthetics alone. Too much there is governed by precise calculation. Too much functions as a single system.